Thank you, Miguel, for being here and having this conversation today with us on the Philosopher in the News. And thank you everyone else for being in the audience on a day that there's quite a lot to be watching, whether on television or Twitter or wherever you get your news about. So just to set the scene a little bit, it's obviously the day of the US presidential election, and there's probably a very near to 50% chance, according to most polls, that Trump will be president of the United States for a second time. And this is obviously just to remind people, after having been convicted of crimes of various kinds, attempted to overthrow the previous US election result, having incited an insurrection against the US Capitol, having been impeached twice by the House of Representatives, and so on. Miguel, you start one of your papers on the nature of crisis by referencing the fact that in the same year that Francis Fukuyama wrote his paper on the end of history, the year was 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, there's another philosopher, the French philosopher Guattari, who published his book, Three Ecologies, in which he was prophesizing an era of crisis, in particular an era of ecological crisis. Interestingly enough, both these people, both Fukuyama and Guattari, mention Trump in their work. Famously, Fukuyama thought it was a great feature of liberal capitalist societies that gave people like Trump other outlets to seek glory besides politics. But what did Guattari make of Trump? What was his take on him?
Right. Okay. That's a good start. Thank you very much, Alexis, and thank you, Anthony, for the invitation. It's great to be with you. Well, I was really surprised when I read the Three Ecologies and the place that Guattari gives to Trump there, because he sees it as a manifestation of this multiple crisis of our ecological system, broadly conceived. So he says yes, there is an environmental dimension, but there's also a social one that has to do with labor relations, and there is a mental or psychological one. Guattari is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, first and foremost. And he compares Trump to a kind of the poison that has invaded the Venice Laguna, and he says similarly the Trump phenomena is poisoning the New York scene, both at the level of social relations through his business and through the visibility that he has through his sort of television shows. And he writes, if I may, just the following. He redeveloped by raising rents, thereby driving out tens of thousands of poor families, most of whom are condemned to homelessness, becoming the equivalent of the dead fish of environmental ecology. So he really sees Trump as, of course, he had no idea of what Trump was going to become, but maybe he would not have been surprised in the end to see this continuity between a certain presence in the economic sphere and the mediatic sphere and its extension in politics. And I think this is something that I think, yeah, we really should think about. I mean, in a way that perhaps prefigured that, or was more or less contemporaneous, something not dissimilar happened in Italy with Berlusconi also. So the move from a certain presence in economic sphere to it's a sphere of influence. Of course, we're seeing that with Musk now too, all the way to politics. And of course, it depends on which perspective you see it from. But from Guattari's perspective, it's clear. Yeah. Clearly sort of bad news. Yeah.
Sounds a little bit like Guattari is putting his finger on this term that's become a bit of a buzz term, a polycrisis, right? This idea that there's a series of intertwining or interacting crises at the political level, the social level, the economic, the ecological level.
Yeah.
Before we get into the way that you sort of think about different forms of crisis and how we should be really distinguishing between different forms and how to think about them, what do you make of these terms that have kind of entered common parlance? Anthony mentioned permacrisis earlier, this idea that we're always in a permanent sort of state of crisis. Polycrisis has become a bit of a buzzword. Are these useful terms in helping us understand our current predicament? What do you make of them?
Yeah, well, that's precisely what I wanted to look into, right? So I think there are two sides to it. There's from my perspective where I was arriving at it, having not really focused on the notion of crisis. First of all, its omnipresence, the fact that everything seems to be in crisis or a crisis.
Mhm.
So much so that, yes, one could then talk about a form of chronic crisis or a polycrisis or a permacrisis. But if that's the case, then how do you distinguish between crisis and the normal state of affairs? So if everything is in crisis or a crisis,
Mhm.
first of all, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between the kinds of crisis that we're dealing with and the urgency with which we should address them. And then this cumulative effect also has a paralyzing effect on us, because then we don't know which ones to go to, which ones to prioritize. Now, so I think that we have reasons to be skeptical when faced with crisis as a label. It feels a bit like one has to, and of course, in this domain where everything is in a crisis, one has to shout always louder in order to be heard. So you have to
Mhm.
say crisis, crisis more loudly each time to draw people's attention. And we know that that's the way the media, social media operate today, right? Having
So
said
there's a
that,
danger of it losing it really its
it's
salience as a term.
exactly. And so the other side for me, well, is there still uh, a reason why, or a number of reasons why we should hold on to this notion of crisis?
Mm.
And what kind of phenomenon, what kind of event, what kind of creature or thing are we talking about when we talk about crisis?
Yeah, yeah. Let's go back to the beginning, as it were, of give a kind of very brief genealogical account of the term. As you mention in your work, crisis is a term that, in the context of the social world and the philosophy of science and science more generally, it's almost a bit like a metaphor. It's a borrowed term from medicine, as well as in some contexts ancient Greek tragedy, so borrowed from literature as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of the term crisis and how does it transfer from one domain to the other?
Yeah. Well, originally, so in the Greek, krine means to judge. So it
Mm.
has to do with this moment of judgment.
Hmm.
Uh, Therefore, this moment of decision. So it's really bound up with the idea of decision, and therefore with something like a critical moment. Right. So in John's Gospel, for example, in the Apocalypse, the judgment of God, right? The term that is used there is krima, so it is related to this idea of crisis. So yeah, the term has its roots in sort of legal thought of theological language, and then as you were saying, it becomes crucial in ancient medicine, but a medicine that really lasted up until the 18th century. So one could say that Western medicine, from the Hippocratic and Corpus and Galen all the way to the 18th century, was a medicine of crisis. And
Mm.
I think it's because it was so prevalent that it and because it offers a way of tracking, it has a temporality, right? So it allows us to track a pathology, a disease, and to see the moment at which it reaches this critical point that leads either to recovery or death. Right? So
Mm.
it was a useful paradigm to try and understand other kinds of phenomena and social political events in particular. So it's the other day I was sort of reading Augustine's City of God, and I think you see it there, but even more, I think, palpably in Machiavelli, even though
Mm.
Machiavelli does not use the notion of crisis, the way in which he understands history, one could say his own philosophy of history and his attempt to understand his own, yeah, we would say today well, he calls them tumults or troubles, and he even speaks in a way of sort of chronic crisis of Florence in the 14th century, the vocabulary that he uses is completely medical. And I think we have even extensions of that, in the 20th century, when Wilhelm Röpke, for example, reacting to Keynesian economics right in the middle of the Second World War, 1942-43, presents his own work as the work of a physician trying to fix a real problem, and gives political economy and economics a kind of authority that it really really I think grew so much in the 20th century. I think it's quite astonishing in a way, that the diagnostic and
To what extent? So there are some interesting aspects there. One is this idea that crisis is a fork in the road. It can lead to a positive result, but it can also lead to an even worse result than the position one is in now. But it also has this element, as you say, of judgment, of it being a sort of, it's not just a objective state of affairs out there in the world. And I wonder, to what extent do you think that survives in the way that we think of crises today in the social world, or say in the context of science and natural science, when Thomas Kuhn famously talks about science sometimes undergoing a crisis? Is the element of judgment still preserved in the way we talk about crisis today?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think when we define something as a crisis, right? Even I would say, or especially at a pre-philosophical, pre-theoretical level, I think we are trying to. There's definitely a descriptive element to it, right? We're trying to say this is a crisis of, even if we don't quite know what it is a crisis of. This idea that we should be able to understand what it is a crisis of. But at the same time, I think it has a prescriptive dimension. By virtue of defining it as a crisis, we feel that something ought to be done about it. Even if we don't know what ought to be done, that something should be done, I think, is built into the very notion of crisis, and therefore involves something like a moment of decision. Right? It's very difficult to say, I'm facing a crisis. Let's take it to the personal level, but I'm not going to do anything about it. That would be odd. And I think it's the same thing at the social political level. Of course, it's harder at the social political level.
So the diagnosis is both a description of a state of affairs, but also already it contains a sort of normative judgment that this is not a good thing, and we need to move beyond it in some way. That something needs to be done.
Exactly. And then the problems start just there, right? Because then, what kind of solution, what kind of action is required, is what's open to debate, of course.
So let's get into your typology, as it were, of the term crisis, and with it these kind of different approaches to, I guess, solving or resolving a crisis. So you distinguish between three fundamental types of crisis. One, you call it the crisis of deviation, crisis of exception, crisis of contradiction. There might be a fourth potential category that we might come to later. But can you briefly describe what these three different types represent? And then maybe we'll talk about the different kind of forms of solution or resolution that they require.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, I see that sort of typology as one way of trying to distinguish between crises. So this is the work that I found myself having to do in order to understand, okay, let's assume that all of those crises that we are told are crises really are. Let's see if they are all can easily be subsumed under the same notion, as if crisis had one modus operandi that could apply to every crisis across the spectrum and across history, or whether it has sort of different modes of operation or different regimes, as I call them. And this is where I came up with this sort of fourfold, and we might get to the final one, which I think is the most severe one at the end of our discussion. And can I just say, before I go into this typology, that I think it's one way of trying to distinguish between them. Of course, there have been other ways of doing it, especially coming out, I think, of not only of critical theory, right, that speaks of crisis of legitimation, crisis of representation, crisis of hegemony, etc. Right? So I think they're not incompatible. I think they're absolutely compatible and complementary. So what I mean by a crisis of deviation, and before I go into all of those, I think that they all have something in common, which is the understanding, and I think this speaks to our own present or our own moment. They all have something to do with the idea of the norm and a certain violence that is done to the norm, whatever system we may be talking about, right? So it can be a physical human system, it can be a scientific paradigm, it can be a polity, it can be an economy, etc. So a crisis of deviation, sometimes I wonder whether that's even a crisis, right? I say a crisis of deviation is one that is characterized by a deviation from a norm, which is always a range, right? Not a strict norm, that is greater than usual, right? So it's one that is met, one about which we assume that either naturally of itself or through some minimal intervention, we will be able to bring it back to its normal range. And that is, I think, what we normally understand when we talk about crisis management. Right?
Right.
A crisis can be managed by not calling into question at all the system that is being managed. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's the lowest sort of level of crisis, if you will. Right?
In your work, you mentioned, for example, the national health system in the UK that every winter undergoes a kind of crisis. I mean, there's a bigger question, I guess, about whether the NHS is facing a deeper, more fundamental type of crisis.
And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think between the time I started thinking about the NHS and now, and living abroad, I realized that it's gone from bad to worse. And we've all heard sort of horrible stories about people deal
but
with.
Thinking back to, I would say, I don't know, pre-pandemic times when every winter, because of a confluence of reasons, people get the flu more, people's immune system is suppressed, people fall down when it's slippery outside.
Leaves on the track, right?
Yeah.
It creates a kind of mini crisis where people are late, people are very much annoyed. There is some degree of disruption, but
but it's not. It doesn't put into question: do we, should the national health system exist? Should be run this way at all? It is just a deviation that needs management, and then we're back to normal, as it were. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, what I would like to say about this is that it seems to me that under our sort of, broadly speaking, liberal governmentality, that is the default position. That is, in the face of a crisis, governments tend to interpret them and deal with them as if they were
something to be managed,
of deviation. And the whole question is, well, are they of that kind? And therefore, is management really what we need? And that question can only be attached to specific problems and situations, right? So we can't answer that question in general terms. Now, there is a certain violence that is done to the norm there, but it's only one of deviation. Another growing to the point that someone like Agamben says that it has become the norm. I don't quite agree with that, but it is increasingly becoming the norm. And I think that would take us directly back to the American election and the possible outcome should Trump be elected, is a crisis of exception, or a situation that is perceived as a threat to the nation, the body politic, the bodies that constitute the body politic. I'm here thinking of the pandemic, and therefore require a special measure, which is the suspension of the rule of law, emergency measures. I mean, different countries have different names for it. But there again, this response that is one of suspension is, like management, intrinsically conservative. I think what they have in common is the idea that there will be a return to a normality that we need not call into question as such.
Right.
And so I see those two as different and yet having something in common. Whereas the third type, which is a more radical type, is the type that, of course, coming out of a tradition that goes back to Hegel and Marx in particular, and post-Marxist thought, is the one that sees crisis as synonymous with contradiction. And in a way, I think in the history of philosophy, at least, the Hegelian, post-Hegelian Marxist tradition is the only one really that has formalized, right, and problematized this idea of crisis through this originally dialectical, logical notion of contradiction. Now, why is this important? Well, I think there are two ways of understanding contradictions, right? The non-dialectical way, which is to say, well, it is just logically not possible that you have A and non-A at the same time. So one has to go, or one has to be identified as actually not what it appears to be. And there is the dialectical one that sees that, well, the coexistence of A and non-A is precisely the very engine, the very spring of motion, movement in general, and specifically social and political. So
it contains the seed, as it were, of the resolution of the contradiction.
It contains the seed of the resolution. So what does this mean? It means that however negative it appears to be, it contains within itself, but that requires a form of action on our part and a form of profound transformation. It contains the seed of its overcoming, its Aufhebung, right? The possibility of starting afresh or a new beginning. And crises of contradiction are therefore, I think, the most sort of profound, because they, if identified as such, they require a moment of invention, transformation, creation. Business can no longer go on as usual. So we cannot carry on as if this wasn't happening. We cannot simply tweak the system in the hope that we'll be able to go back to the norm. And of course, the whole question is, isn't the history of liberal capitalist societies the history of
tinkering around the edges,
tweaking the system, to an extent displacing the problems every time in the hope that this will solve well, knowing full well that it won't, but at least it will postpone the moment of absolute crisis, right? And maybe this moment of polycrisis, chronic crisis, permacrisis is all of those crises sort of coming, a moment of reckoning, if you will, that requires something more than just a tinkering around the edges.
So obviously lots of alarm bells ringing in terms of the context in which we're talking about tonight. And you already mentioned the US elections and Trump and talking about this. So I think it's fair to say that American politics treated the Trump phenomenon as a crisis of deviation at best, right? It was a blip, it was an accident, this wasn't meant to happen. This person wasn't part of, the Republican establishment. It was hijacked the party. And that, with the Biden presidency, things would get back to normal. In fact, that was more or less the ticket with which, Biden got elected, bringing back some kind of normality. And recently we've had similar pleas for a return to normality by one of the Conservative Party candidates that didn't end up winning the leadership in the end, James Cleverly, who said we need to be more normal. So the fact that Trump obviously didn't go away and is very likely, at least, to be president again, points to the fact that this is not a crisis of deviation. And you said that you think it points to the fact that it's a crisis of exception. I was wondering whether it points to something even deeper, that it's a kind of contradiction at the base of the phenomenon, right? That it really is pointing at something deeply wrong with the way that American politics, liberal democracy, various tensions that we have between, as you mentioned in some of your work, between the nation state and the globalized international order. What do you think? How would you read the kind of crisis that American politics is going through? Would you think it's a crisis of exception, of contradiction, and how can we tell which one it is?
So I completely agree with what you just said. I think the Trump phenomena is in of itself not a crisis, but an answer to the crisis, and it's an answer that is itself exceptionalist, right? Agamben, in one of his books, I think in The State of Exception, mentions this legal theorist Clement Rossiter, who's writing in the 1940s, and he talks about the constitutional dictatorship under Abraham Lincoln, and he said our president that has come closest to, of course, but we're talking about the American Civil War, and so the suspension of habeas corpus, the rule of law, in a very specific situation, right? I think we had, and he says, this constitutional dictatorship, given the threats that we are facing, and he was talking about mostly the nuclear threat, but also I think he had in mind already the terrorist threats that have grown, the bio threats that we need to add to this. He predicted that the state of exception was going to be a normal form of government. And that is to say, constitutional dictatorship is perhaps no longer going to be so abnormal as we thought it should be or would be. And so you think of Viktor Orban, in Hungary. You think about Netanyahu, even independently of what's happening now, but his attempt to reduce the power of the Supreme Court, right, to strengthen the executive against the other powers, is a tendency that we have and many embrace, because that's the question, is how is it that so many people, knowing full well what the program is, opt for, in a paradoxical way, in the name of freedom, for the exact opposite, for a form of voluntary servitude. I mean, Trump is being very clear about what it is that he's planning to do in terms of concentration of power. How is that compatible with the land of the free? I think it isn't. So I think that's one of the contradictions. And a major feature of that, I think, is, and I think it is part of this biothread because it is biologized in a way, is the question of immigration. Immigration is seen as a threat to the immunity and the health of the body politic. So of course, racism is built into that, but the fear of the migrant is a fear of, again, I think problem displacement, right? It's an attempt to identify a clear target instead of looking at the more deep-seated contradictions. And I don't know if you want to talk about those more deep-seated contradictions. But
yeah.
One of them.
I just want to get clear in what sense. So the way to think about it is, Trump is diagnosing, as it were, or the kind of Trumpian politics that we see in other places. You mentioned Hungary, are diagnosing a kind of deeper contradiction within the political system, whether a tension between nation states and globalization, or a tension between an aging population and the desire for constant growth, whatever kind of norms we want to pick out as being in tension with each other and kind of non-compatible. And the point is that Trump is presented as this, okay, we need to do something exceptional, crazy, overthrow the kind of normal rules of politics where we elect people that respect the rule of law and play by the rules and don't do crazy stuff, just so that they can bring things back to normal. And of course, that's also a big
Mhm.
Part of Trump's pitch, right, always has been like, make America great again. It is the idea of like, let's bring things back to a kind of older era. So in some ways, they're doing the first part right, as it were. They're diagnosing a crisis, but then they're not treating the crisis as it should be treated, namely as a sort of trying to find a resolution of the contradictions. Instead, there's this kind of suspension of the rules and making an exception and thinking that will make things go away. What I was going to ask is, I guess, do crises sometimes just result in that there is no resolution? We just end up in this state of suspension or backsliding that some people talk about democratic backsliding. So we have a problem. We've ended up in a point where we have a problem. We don't go forward, we go backwards, as it were.
Yeah. I think that the word, and I think we shouldn't be afraid of using it, even though it doesn't mean necessarily what it means in Marxism-Leninism. But I think the word for resolution in relation to crisis of contradiction, I think the proper word is revolution.
Revolution, yeah.
Revolution, because it calls for a radical transformation. Now, if we are indeed confronted with a state of chronic contradictions, the sort of action that is required is itself radical and far more difficult to implement and imagine than the others. And so I agree with what you just said about Trump, who I think manages to put his finger on real problems that have to do with, or at least pointing to sources of dissatisfaction that always have to do with a strategy of the scapegoat, right? So it's the technocracy, but it's true that there is a real disillusion with the managerial, the technocratic, so Washington, Capitol Hill, the swamp, etc. And also that's within and without the immigration, the migrant, right? So if only we could deal with the swamp and we could deal with and build the wall,
all our problems will be solved. Yeah,
our problems would be solved. Now, because he also, I think, understands and speaks to this disenfranchised industrial belt that is not benefiting at all from the growth that the United States have still managed to produce, or managed to produce more than Europe, for example. He manages to also indicate how he might bring something back. I think the Make America Great Again, I think, also contains this economic dimension. But he, like, threatening with the sort of tariffs, so abrogating, in a way, as a capitalist, contemplating the transgression of capitalist taboos. I mean, to limit sort of free trade. But it doesn't take much to scratch the surface of the dogma of American free trade and to see that because it is the empire, it is always done on its own terms. So America has always been an extraordinarily protectionist economy. So it's a complicated picture, but I think he does manage to speak to the fundamental disappointment, discontent, if not anger, of a large part of the American population. So he is in no way, I think, interested in getting to the root of the American problems. But in that respect, I don't see that the Democrats are either. I think
well, they're part of the team. The system isn't broken. It just needs a bit of tinkering around the edges.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a lot more to talk about in terms of how contradictions get resolved, how that's different in the social realm compared to, say, the realm of a scientific endeavor. And I urge people to read your book when it comes out, because you have a lot of interesting thoughts there that bring in thinkers from Kuhn and Lakatos and Lukács and Marx and Hegel and all these people to think a little bit more carefully about contradictions and how they get resolved. I mean, I'll ask you one last question about this particular situation that we're in now. I mean, some people are thinking that, well, if Trump wins, this will be the last kind of, US election, which I think is probably a little bit over dramatic. But if that were the case, say if as a result of, these contradictions that have remained unresolved, America does become a kind of form of authoritarian state, even if, it still has elections, like say Russia has elections, they don't really mean anything. It's just a performative act. How should we describe that then? Should we still be describing American politics as in a state of crisis, or is that then past that point? Is it already in the throes of the death loop, as it were?
The term that I would use to describe it and to describe our situation perhaps more generally is the term that Gramsci uses in the 1930s to address the rise of fascism as an interregnum, as an in-between, where you feel that something is collapsing, that is the previous consensus or hegemony has collapsed or is collapsing, and that generates, and those are again his words, morbid symptoms. And this is where I think dialectical resolution just doesn't work, or it can take so many years that
Right.
it doesn't mean that we can live for a very long time by sort of endlessly generating morbid symptoms that can lead to absolute death and not life. So I don't share the sort of dialectical optimism in that respect. And that can take many forms, right? Including a form of biopolitics that is also a necropolitics. I think it can be lethal in that respect, and distinguish between different kinds of lives that are more or less worthy of living. So morbid symptoms in a very broad sense. So I agree. We could have something like a constitutional dictatorship that works for some, with a considerable cost for many, but that sort of carries on for a long time.
So that's the famous Gramsci quote about the old order having died, the new one not having yet born, and this being the time of monsters. I don't know if that's an accurate translation, but yeah.
I think the consensus that in our liberal democracies has come to an end, and a fairly abrupt end, I think, after 2009, 2008, 2009, is the neoliberal consensus that had emerged from a previous crisis, which was, as Habermas says, the crisis of legitimation of the mid-1970s, following the oil shock. So we lived, a few, perhaps 4 decades of a certain kind of consensus that that range from, Thatcher to Blair to Clinton to the Obamas to, and I think Trump has understood that this is no longer viable. So, and what he has to offer, I think, is possibly worse, but nonetheless, he appears to be, and of course, this is another thing that Gramsci talks about, which is very dangerous, is that this interregnum is the time when saving figures can emerge and people can feel drawn to particularly charismatic, not that you or I would find Trump charismatic, but many do. So attach their own destiny to a saving figure. And I think the return of the religious also in liberal democracies is very, in Europe, in the US, in Israel, I mean, and there are so many, I think we need to, I think Margaret Atwood in that respect is very much present in our mind, because she, sort of managed to foresee something that we are currently living, and this idea of a return, right? As you said, America, this in the face of this collapse, we want to hold on to something and return, even if it means return to God, return to religion, return to a time when women had no rights over their own bodies. You know, why not? Maybe it was better then, after all.
I'm conscious of the time, and I'd like to
Sorry.
open up for questions. I have one last question that maybe you can touch on briefly, because you do mention there's this one other type of crisis that we haven't touched upon, which is a crisis of extinction, right? And so, in some ways, the crisis of contradiction is the most severe one that we've talked so far, but it's also hopeful in a way because it can potentially point to a form of resolution. But then you say there is also a type of crisis that isn't just intrinsically negative, and you say the point to a horizon or creation or hope doesn't exist. It's we only have collapse and extinction. And you're thinking there particularly of ecological collapse, but can you touch a little bit very briefly on this type of crisis and what forms it can take before we could jump into questions?
Yeah, so very, very quickly, the way in which I tend to think of a crisis of extinction or collapse, I think that can apply to ourselves as, you know, individuals. Think of a sort of deep depression, life collapsing onto itself. We did mention the notion of collapse in relation to a consensus or hegemony. So I think it can apply to the social sphere too. But I think it does apply to the ecological sphere in particular for the following reasons, that unlike the crisis of contradictions, where if we see them as contradiction, we still believe that there is a horizon, a normative horizon, that we can generate new norms that will redefine the way in which we live together.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think that in the case of a crisis of collapse, and this applies to the biosphere, it's the normativity of the biosphere itself that is eroded or that is challenged. So it's its ability to generate new norms that is being affected. It is becoming increasingly difficult for it to do what it has always done, that is to say, allow proliferation, multiplication of species, and to invent new norms in the face of, yeah, real challenges that have always existed. But now, because of a human action, this range on its part, her part, Gaia, I don't know, is being limited. So in that
So
respect,
to put it maybe, I mean, in terms of a philosopher we haven't talked about, in the language of Wittgenstein, so it's not just the collapse of one form of life or one
no,
form of life, it's the collapse of the conditions for the possibility of any form of life.
exactly. It's in a way, it's a transcendental physical collapse, and that is the greatest challenge that we can possibly think of, the one that touches on not just our own conditions of existence, wherever we might live, however we might live, however poor or rich, of course, it affects always the poor more. It is global in a way that I think nothing has ever been global. I think even globalized capitalism has not been as global as this threat. And of course, the huge question is, well, I think by virtue of it being a crisis of collapse and people knowing it, instead of being bumped up to top of the list every time there is a survey about what is the most significant problem, it's always, you know, fourth, fifth, 10th position.
At best, yeah.
Yeah, at best, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a hopeful reading would be to say that even the ecological crisis can be read as a crisis of contradiction, right? A contradiction between, well, we want life to go on, we're committed to our own sort of propagation and at a personal level, but also at a kind of collective level, and those norms are clashing with our economic and political norms. We just need to find a way of resolving that contradiction. I guess that would be a slightly more optimistic way of reading.
Yeah, I think there's still time to think of a new normality that could be invented, but one in which points of irreversibility, thresholds that have been crossed, can no longer be, because we're dealing with thermodynamics. So things, or you know,
be out of our hands. Yeah,
yeah, Macbeth. What's done's done, and it cannot be undone. So there's certain things that cannot be undone, but it doesn't mean that we can't delay or stop some of the other things and do differently and do other things.
Okay, I've got one question that I can see in the Q&A. I'm just asking people to put their questions in there in case they're putting them in the chat. So one of the question is, that crises seem quite unpalatable to a large swathe of people. What are we to do about the scenario in which powerful people are able to convince people that a crisis is not actually a crisis? And the person says probably through some kind of conspiracy theory sort of narrative. So how do we fight this threat of people not really wanting to recognize there is a crisis?
Yeah, well, yeah. I think this is the democratic space. I mean, there's a dispute around what is or is not a crisis, and I think the only way to do that is through arguments and solid information. So a combination of critical thought and science. I don't see any other way. Now, the one difficulty which we have not touched upon, I think, is a crisis cannot be recognized as such, I think, if it is not experienced or felt at emotional, affective level. So no matter how persuasive I might be theoretically, I think it will still not have the right kind of impact or point of recognition if it is not experienced physically or emotionally.
But going back to that idea that crisis is fundamentally has to involve a judgment on the part of the people that are
but a
experiencing
judgment
it.
that is also it also happens at the gut level. So I think there's there's the theoretical, the practical, but also the emotional or the
Here's a question for you. I guess slightly can be put in a challenging manner. So we're talking about liberal democracy as a sort of like not really recognizing this idea of having to transcend itself potentially. But one of the questions is about how this idea of norm crisis, norm recovery, or return sits with the ideas of progress or continuous improvement. So the latter is obviously kind of an Enlightenment legacy, which liberal Democrats often associate with themselves with. Think there is constant progress. We can always kind of better ourselves and resolve any tensions that we find. So how do these two kind of options of crisis, return back to an old idea, or crisis, therefore progress, sits with your critique?
Yeah, I would be reticent to say that we can always do better. I think we should always ask ourselves, what can we do and what can we do better? But to have as a sort of a priori or principle that we can do better, and that history is history of us always trying to do better and therefore progressive in that respect. No, I don't. I think there's too much evidence of that. No, but you mentioned Fukuyama and towards the very beginning. I think, yeah, this is in a way is what I say in the article and the book, that I grew up in that sort of sense of a certain end of history, like liberal democracy, open markets as now the unsurpassable horizon of our time, and we realize that no, it is just not the case. So, but I'm not even sure that the Enlightenment version that you gave is the best version of Enlightenment. I
Sure.
think this
A very caricatured version, but one that often gets
sort of
bandied
happy.
about by people like Steven Pinker, for example. And that's all very tied to liberal democracy and attaching themselves to the same kind of politics.
In a very interesting article from the early 90s, Derrida has a very, I think a very problematizing and interesting reading of the heritage of the Enlightenment, not wanting to do away entirely with the rationality of the Enlightenment, but talking about a form of rationality and therefore a form of action and a form of justice that is always to come. And I think that is what we need to ask ourselves, what can be done.
Okay, one more question from Su Mingku, who asks, crisis is said to be a point when normative foundations are laid bare. I wonder if a sense of normative avoidance or depthlessness contributes to the sense of gravity or polycrisis. A sense of normative avoidance or depthlessness contributes to the sense of polycrisis. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So do you think you can sort of translate it? I mean, how do you understand it? I would hate to. Not,
Normative avoidance or depthlessness. I guess maybe the idea that maybe they're hinting at the idea that we're not very cognizant always of or conscious of what our norms are. We're not necessarily conscious of the principles, say, that we espouse, even if we do implicitly. And it's often, the work of philosophers to make those things explicit, to, tell us what the norms of what we do every day anyway are, even though we're not kind of consciously thinking of them.
yeah.
And so I guess the question is whether lacking a sense of those contributes to the sense of having a polycrisis, that as in we're not very clear about what is intention with what, so we just see a mess of things that are going badly. So we can't know, we don't even know where to start, as it were. That's anyway. That's my interpretation. Sorry if that's not what I.
Okay, so but if that is the question, then that takes us back to the very beginning of our conversation. Yes, in this state of polycrisis, that I think intertwine different normative systems that we are governed by without necessarily being aware of them, the result being a sense of paralysis, or sense of being overwhelmed, and therefore the notion of crisis itself is one that we might identify with, but without really understanding what it is, what it contains, and the complexity of what it contains. So I think very, very much so. But this is where, and this is where, and maybe I should have started with this, because for me, a philosophy of crisis is a critique of crisis. In the technical Kantian sense, but you find also in Benjamin when he talked about critique of violence. That is to say, trying to. I think that's the philosophical
unpack.
work,
What
to
exactly?
try and undo the threads, identify them, and as a condition of action, as a condition also of orienting ourselves in this mess.
Yeah. Maybe you could have add as a subtitle to your book a critique of polycrisis or something like that.
Exactly. Maybe that should be the title. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. D. Smith asks, is there any analysis on the speed or slowness of resolution of various kinds of crisis and how that affects or relates to the severity or intensity of those crises? In other words, do more severe questions resolve more quickly or more slowly?
Yeah, so I don't think, well, I'd be interested to see what the person thinks, but I don't think we can answer that question in sort of broad terms. But I think we need to be careful in the face of easy fixes, right? So typically a state of exception. So we tend to be short-termist, and if the crisis is a complex one, presumably the solution and the way out would require time, and also would require time to imagine solution, but also to persuade others in a sort of democratic process, to get people on board, to steer the ship in a different direction. So maybe this is a paradox, because if the crisis is extremely severe, well, we would want it to be solved immediately. But the paradox is that severity might require, for example, the ecological crisis. We know that it will not be solved immediately. It requires a tremendous amount of efforts and collaboration across states, and of course, the state structure is in a way a problem in that respect, as well as a part of the solution.